Well, hello there, my dear friends. Come, pull up that favorite chair of yours. Pour yourself a warm cup of coffee or tea and settle in with me for a little while. I'm Joe, though most folks around these parts have taken to calling me Grandpa Joe, a title I've grown quite fond of over the years, and I'm absolutely delighted that you've chosen to spend part of your day here with me. You know, at 65, I've come to understand that life is really just a collection of stories, isn't it? Some of them we tell proudly at dinner parties, others we whisper to ourselves in quiet moments. And then there are those stories, the ones that sit heavy in our hearts for decades, waiting for just the right moment to finally see the light of day. Today, I want to share one of those stories with you. It's been living in the corners of my soul for 47 years now, and it's a story about love, about fear, about the crushing weight of words left unspoken and chances left untaken. But more than that, it's a story about the most important lesson I've ever learned. That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's feeling that terror all the way down to your bones and choosing to act anyway. Before we dive into this journey together, if you're finding something meaningful in these conversations we're having, if these stories are bringing you a moment of comfort, perhaps stirring up memories of your own, or simply providing a friendly voice when the world feels a little too quiet, I would be truly honored if you'd consider subscribing to our little corner of the internet here. It helps me reach other souls who might need to hear these stories. And it tells me that what we're sharing together has real value in your life. Now, let me take you back to a time when the world felt both infinite and impossibly small, when every emotion burned like fire and every moment seemed to carry the weight of eternity. Let me take you back to 1975 when I was 17 years old and thought I knew everything about love and absolutely nothing about courage. So picture, if you will, Lincoln High School in the spring of 1970. The hallways smelled like floor wax and teenage hope, echoing with the sounds of locker doors slamming and sneakers squeaking against linoleum that had seen better decades. And it was the kind of small-town school where the same 200 kids had known each other since kindergarten, where your reputation was carved in stone by 7th grade and changing it required nothing short of a miracle. And I was Joe Morrison then, not Grandpa Joe, just Joe. And I occupied that peculiar space in the high school ecosystem reserved for the quietly unremarkable. I wasn't popular enough to sit at the cool kids' table, wasn't athletic enough to be a star, wasn't troubled enough to be interesting. I was the kid who got B's in most subjects, played third base on the baseball team with adequate skill, and had exactly 3 close friends who knew me well enough to understand that beneath my average exterior lived a heart that felt everything far too deeply. And then there was Sarah. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, and how do you describe someone who seemed to exist in Technicolor while the rest of us lived in black and white? She was 17, like me, but she moved through the world with a grace and confidence that made her seem years older, as if she'd been let in on some secret about life that the rest of us were still trying to figure out. Her hair was the color of autumn in New England, not quite brown, not quite red, but something magical in between that caught the light streaming through the tall windows of our old school building and made you forget whatever profound thought you were supposed to be having. She had eyes the color of deep forest pools, the kind that seemed to hold entire conversations. And when she smiled, really smiled. Not the polite version she gave to teachers and acquaintances. It was like watching sunrise after the longest night of your life. But Sarah's beauty wasn't the kind that intimidated you into silence. It was the kind that made you want to be better than you were, to rise to meet her level instead of feeling diminished by it. And she was editor of the school newspaper, president of the debate team, and had already been accepted to the State University with a partial scholarship for journalism. She wrote articles for the Lincoln Herald that made our small town feel important, that found profound meaning in ordinary events like school board meetings and local elections. What made Sarah truly special? Though what set her apart from every other pretty, smart girl in our class was her kindness. It wasn't the performative kindness that some people wore like jewelry to make themselves look better. It was the real thing, the kind that came from somewhere deep and true. And she'd sit with the lonely freshmen during lunch, help struggling students with their homework without making them feel stupid, and somehow make everyone around her feel like they mattered, like they had something valuable to contribute to the world. I had been watching Sarah Mitchell from a respectful distance since the beginning of our sophomore year, harboring what I was absolutely certain was the most secret, most impossible crush in the history of teenage romance. I'd memorized her schedule by October of that year. She had AP English third period, lunch at 11:47, and always sat in the third row during school assemblies. I knew she preferred chocolate milk to regular milk, that she read while she ate, usually something far more sophisticated than what the rest of us were reading, and that she had a habit of twirling her pen between her fingers when she was thinking hard about something. But here's the thing that might surprise you. In 3 years of attending the same small high school, Sarah Mitchell and I had barely exchanged more than a dozen words. We moved in different orbits. You see, she floated among the student leaders, the academic achievers, the kids who seemed destined for big things. I drifted among the pleasant but unremarkable, the ones who would probably end up staying in town, working at the hardware store or the bank, living quiet lives that wouldn't make it into any newspapers, or so I thought. It was a Thursday afternoon in May 15th, 1970 to be exact, because some dates get burned into your memory with the kind of precision that defies the normal blurriness of time. The spring sunshine was streaming through the tall windows of our school library, turning the dust motes into tiny dancers in the golden light. I was hunched over a table in the back corner, wrestling with the conclusion to my final project for American history, a research paper about World War II veterans in our community. So I'd spent weeks interviewing elderly men around town, sitting in their living rooms that smelled like coffee and old newspapers, listening to stories about Normandy and the Pacific that they'd never told their own children. These men had trusted me with their memories, their nightmares, their pride, and I was struggling to find words worthy of their sacrifice. The library was nearly empty that afternoon. Most of the other students were outside enjoying the warm weather or had already left for the day. The only sounds were the occasional whisper of turning pages and the soft scratching of my pencil as I crossed out yet another inadequate sentence. And then I heard her voice. "Excuse me," said a voice that seemed to carry music in it. And when I looked up from my paper, there she was, Sarah Mitchell, standing beside my table with an armload of books and a smile that made my heart forget how to beat properly. "You're Joe, right?" she continued. And I managed to nod, probably looking like one of those plastic bobblehead dolls that people put on their car dashboards. "Joe Morrison, from Mrs. Rodriguez's English class." I found my voice, somewhere in the depths of my suddenly constricted throat. "Yes," I managed. That's what I mean. "Do you mind if I sit down?" she asked. And without waiting for my answer, which was good, because I'm not sure I could have formed one, she settled into the chair across from me, setting her books down with the kind of casual grace that made even that simple action seem like poetry. "I've been reading your essays in class," she said. And the world suddenly became very quiet around us, as if even the library itself was holding its breath to listen. "You have this way of writing about ordinary things that makes them feel extraordinary. That piece you wrote about your grandfather's workshop, it made me cry." Now, my friends, I want you to imagine being 17 years old and having the girl you've been admiring from afar for 3 years tell you that your writing made her cry. It was like being struck by lightning while winning the lottery during a solar eclipse. The kind of moment that's so impossibly wonderful that part of your brain insists it must be a dream. "Really?" I asked, and my voice cracked on that single word in a way that would have mortified me under any other circumstances. "Really?" she said, and her smile grew warmer. "You wrote about how he taught you that every piece of wood has a story to tell, and that a good carpenter learns to listen to that story before making the first cut. It was beautiful," Joe, I kept thinking about it for days afterward. And just like that, we were talking. Really talking, not just exchanging pleasantries or working on a group project. We talked about writing, about the power of words to capture moments and feelings that would otherwise slip away into forgotten memory. And she told me about her dream of becoming a foreign correspondent, of traveling the world and telling stories that mattered, stories that could help people understand each other across all the barriers of language and culture and distance. I want to write about the things that connect us, she said, her eyes lighting up with the kind of passion that made you believe she could change the world simply by wanting to badly enough. Not just the big political stories, but the human stories underneath them. The grandmother in war-torn country who still makes bread every morning because it's how she keeps hope alive. The children who play the same games in villages thousands of miles apart, and the ways that love and loss and joy look the same in every language. I found myself telling her about my own dreams, thoughts I'd barely admitted to myself, let alone shared with another human being. How I wanted to study literature, maybe become a teacher someday. How I thought there was something sacred about helping young people find their own voices through writing. I think about Mitch Rodriguez's class, I said, surprising myself with my honesty, and how she gets so excited when one of us discovers something new in a poem or a story, like she's watching us wake up to the world in a new way. I think I might think I'd like to do that for someone someday. Sarah leaned forward, her chin resting on her hand, and I realized she was really listening, and not just waiting for her turn to talk, but actually absorbing what I was saying if it mattered to her. You'd be a wonderful teacher, she said, and the certainty in her voice made me believe, for just a moment, that maybe she was right. We talked for 2 hours in that library, until the late afternoon sun was painting everything in shades of gold and amber. I learned that Sarah was planning to study journalism at the State University, that she'd already been accepted and would be leaving for college in just a few months. She told me about the scholarship she'd earned, about her plans to work for the school newspaper and maybe study abroad her junior year. But mostly, we talked about ideas, about books we'd read and thoughts we'd had and dreams we were afraid to speak out loud. It was the kind of conversation that makes you feel like you've found someone who speaks your language, who sees the world through a lens that somehow matches your own. When the librarian, Patterson, finally came over to tell us that the library would be closing in 10 minutes. We both looked at the clock in genuine surprise. The afternoon had vanished like smoke, leaving us both slightly sheeted and reluctant to break the spell of connection we'd woven between us. We gathered our books and papers in the slightly awkward way of people who weren't quite ready for a perfect moment to end. As we walked toward the library exit, Sarah turned to me with a smile that was different from any I'd seen her give before. Warmer, more personal, as if it was meant just for me. "This was really nice, Joy," she said, and something in her voice made me think she meant it as more than just politeness. And I always wondered what you were thinking about when you got that faraway look in your eyes during English class. Now I think I know. The walk from school to Sarah's house was only 4 blocks, something I'd known for years but had never had reason to mention. We walked slowly that afternoon, both of us seeming to understand instinctively that when we reached her front gate, this magical bubble of conversation would burst, and we'd return to being just classmates who occasionally nodded to each other in the hallway. And the neighborhood around our school was the kind you see in movies about small-town America, where the houses sat close enough together that you could hear your neighbor's radio through the kitchen window and smell Mr. Franklin's pipe tobacco drifting across the backyard fence. Oak trees lined the sidewalks, their new spring leaves creating a canopy of green that filtered the late afternoon sunshine into patterns of light and shadow. We talked as we walked, our conversation meandering like the path itself. Sarah told me about her favorite book, To Kill a Mockingbird, and how reading it had made her want to become a journalist who could shine light on injustice the way Harper Lee had done. I think stories have power, she said, stepping carefully around a crack in the sidewalk. Not just to entertain people, but to help them see the world differently, to make them care about things they might have ignored before. I told her about my own favorite book, Of Mice and Men, and how Steinbeck's ability to find dignity in ordinary people had made me understand that every person carries stories worth telling. My grandfather always said that everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about, I said, surprised by my own willingness to share something so personal. I think that's what good writing does. It helps us understand those battles, helps us be more kind. And when we reached the corner of Maple and 3rd Street, Sarah stopped in front of a small, white house with green shutters and a tiny front porch that held just enough space for a single chair and a small table. Between the house was surrounded by a picket fence that had been painted so many times over the years that the white was thick and soft-looking, like frosting on a cake. "And this is me," she said, but she made no move toward the gate. Instead, she turned to face me fully, and for a moment we just stood there in the golden light of late spring, two 17-year-olds who had somehow stumbled into something that felt much bigger than either of us had expected. "Joe," she said, and my name sounded different when she said it, like it meant something more than just a way to get my attention. "I'm really glad we talked today. I've been wanting to get to know you better for a while now." My heart was doing things that felt medically impossible, and I was quite certain that if she looked closely enough, she'd be able to see it beating through my shirt. "Me too," I managed. And those two simple words carried the weight of 3 years of secret admiration. And she smiled then, not the polite smile she gave everyone, but something warmer, more genuine, and reached out to touch my arm briefly before turning toward her house. "See you tomorrow. Joe Morrison," she called over her shoulder as she walked up the path to her front door. And I stood there watching until she disappeared inside, wondering if the entire afternoon had been some elaborate daydream brought on by too much studying and not enough sleep. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my narrow twin bed, staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, while moonlight streamed through the windows and painted silver rectangles on the wall. Every moment of our conversation played and replayed in my mind like a favorite song you can't stop humming. The way she'd leaned forward when I was talking, as if what I had to say was the most important thing in the world. The sound of her laugh when I told her about the time I'd accidentally quoted Shakespeare in the middle of a baseball game. The moment when our hands had briefly touched as we'd both reached for the same book. And how that simple contact had sent electricity shooting up my arm. Around midnight, sitting at the small desk my father had built for me when I started high school, I made a decision that would haunt me for the next 47 years. And I was going to write Sarah Mitchell a letter. Not just any letter. Mind you, this was going to be the letter, the one where I finally told her how I felt, where I laid my 17-year-old heart bare and trusted her with every secret I'd been carrying. I must have started that letter 27 different ways. Dear Sarah felt too formal, like I was writing to my aunt or applying for a job. Hi Sarah felt too casual, like we were already comfortable with each other, when the truth was that every interaction with her made me feel like I was walking on a tightrope without a net. I tried Sarah by itself, but that seemed incomplete somehow. Too abrupt. Finally, after an hour of false starts and crumpled paper, I settled on Dearest Sarah, which felt both romantic and respectful, though I worried it might be too much, too presumptuous for someone who had barely spoken to her before yesterday. Dearest Sarah, I've been sitting here for the past hour trying to find the right words to begin this letter, and I'm starting to think that maybe there are no right words for what I want to say to you, so I'm just going to be honest and hope that honesty is enough. Do you remember the first time I really noticed you? It was during the fall assembly our sophomore year, when that politician came to speak about youth involvement in local government. Most of us were half asleep, wishing we were anywhere else. But when he asked for questions, you stood up and asked him something that made everyone in that auditorium sit up and pay attention. But you asked him how young people were supposed to care about local politics when most of the decisions that affected us were made behind closed doors by people who hadn't taken the time to understand what our generation actually wanted or needed. And you asked him what he was going to do to change that. And your question was so thoughtful, so well-spoken, that it made everyone else's questions sound shallow by comparison. That was the moment I realized you weren't just another pretty girl in our class. You were someone who thought deeply about the world, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge authority when you thought it was necessary. You were someone worth knowing. I've been watching you since then, not in a creepy way, I hope, but in the way you watch someone who fascinates you, someone who makes you want to be better than you are. I've watched how kind you are to the freshman who sits alone at lunch, how patient you are when you're helping struggling students with their homework. So I've seen how your face lights up when you discover something new in a book or a poem, how you get excited about ideas in a way that makes me excited about them too. Yesterday, when we talked in the library, I felt like I was finally meeting someone who understood the way I see the world. When you said my writing made you cry, it meant more to me than any grade I've ever received or any game I've ever won. It made me feel like maybe the things I think about, the way I try to capture moments and feelings in words, might actually matter to someone besides me. I know we're from different worlds. Sarah, you're headed for big things: university, journalism school, traveling the world and telling important stories. I'm just a small-town kid who wants to teach English and help teenagers find their own voices through writing. But yesterday, for 2 hours in that library, it felt like maybe our worlds could fit together somehow. I think that I'm falling in love with you. Not the dramatic, the movie-style love that teenagers usually claim to feel, but something deeper and more real than that. I'm falling in love with the way you see the world, with your kindness and your intelligence and your passion for justice. I'm falling in love with the person you are when you think no one is watching, and the person you become when you're excited about something you care about. I know this letter might be too much, too soon. I know you might read this and think I'm just another boy with a crush who doesn't really know you at all. But I had to write it because I've learned something important in the past few years. The things we don't say have a way of haunting us. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to tell you how I feel. If you feel even a fraction of what I'm feeling. If our conversation yesterday meant something to you too, then maybe we could spend some time getting to know each other better. We could write letters when we're at different colleges. We could visit each other. We could see if this connection between us is something that could grow into something lasting and beautiful. If you don't feel the same way, I understand. I hope we can still be friends, because yesterday was the best afternoon I've had in all of high school. And I don't want to lose the chance to have conversations like that with you. Well, regardless of what happens next, I want you to know that you've already changed my life just by being yourself. And you've shown me what it looks like to care about something bigger than yourself. Oh, Shilam, to be kind without expecting anything in return. To be confident without being arrogant. And you've made me want to be the kind of person who deserves to know someone like you. Thank you for the gift of yesterday. Thank you for seeing something in my writing that made you want to talk to me. Well, saying thank you for making me feel, for 2 perfect hours, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. With all my love, Joe. I wrote those 4 pages by hand, in my best penmanship, on the good stationery my mother had given me for Christmas. When I finished, the clock on my nightstand read 3:17 a.m., and my hand was cramping from gripping the pen so tightly, sealed the letter in an envelope, wrote Sarah Mitchell across the front in carefully formed letters, and placed it on my desk where I would see it first thing in the morning. Then I fell into the first peaceful sleep I'd had in days, dreaming of golden libraries and autumn-colored hair, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the girl of my dreams might feel something for me too. But morning has a way of making midnight courage seem like midnight foolishness. When I woke up at 6:30 the next morning, that letter seemed to mock me from where it sat on my desk. in the harsh light of dawn. Every word I'd written felt too much, too intense, too revealing. What had seemed romantic and heartfelt at 3 in the morning now felt desperate and presumptuous. I read it again, and with each paragraph, I felt smaller and more embarrassed. What if Sarah thought I was some kind of stalker who had been watching her obsessively for 3 years? What if she shared the letter with her friends, and I became the subject of cafeteria gossip for the remaining weeks of school? What if she felt sorry for me? That particular kind of gentle pity that somehow hurts worse than outright rejection. Worse yet, what if I had completely misread our conversation in the library? What if what had felt like meaningful connection to me had just been Sarah being polite to a classmate? What if she'd been trying to be kind, and I'd mistaken kindness for romantic interest? The more I thought about all the ways giving her that letter could go wrong, the more convinced I became that I was making a terrible mistake. I had managed to have one perfect conversation with Sarah Mitchell. Wasn't it better to preserve that memory than to risk destroying it by pushing for something more? I convinced myself that I was being mature, practical, protective of our newfound friendship. Told myself that maybe this was just the beginning, that we could build on our connection slowly, naturally, without the pressure of romantic declarations and emotional intensity. So I put the letter back in my desk drawer, and I told myself I'd give it to her later, when I was more confident about how she felt. I told myself I'd wait and see if she sought me out again, if she gave me clearer signs that she was interested in something more than friendship. But later never came. For the remaining weeks of our senior year, Sarah and I continued to have those wonderful library conversations. 3 or 4 times, we found ourselves studying at the same table, and we'd end up talking for hours about books, about writing, about our plans for the future. And she'd ask about my college plans. I'd ask about her scholarship. We developed the kind of comfortable friendship that feels both precious and frustrating when you're harboring deeper feelings. And she always seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. Always remembered details from our previous conversations. So when I mentioned that I was nervous about my upcoming interview for college admissions, she brought me an article she'd clipped from a magazine about interview tips. And when she told me she was struggling with her final English paper, I offered to read it and give her feedback, an offer she accepted with a smile that made me wonder if she'd been hoping I'd ask. But I never gave her the letter. Every time we talked, every time she smiled at me in that particular way, every time she seemed to linger a little longer than necessary after our conversations, I'd feel that letter burning in my desk drawer at home. I'd promised myself that tomorrow would be the day, that I'd finally find the courage to tell her how I felt. But tomorrow kept turning into next week, and next week kept turning into next month. And before I knew it, graduation was upon us. At the graduation ceremony, held on a perfect June evening in our school's football stadium, I sat 3 rows behind Sarah and watched as she walked across that stage to receive her diploma. When they called her name, she practically glowed with pride and accomplishment, and I felt a fierce surge of admiration mixed with something that might have been grief. After the ceremony, in the chaos of families taking pictures and friends making promises to stay in touch, Sarah found me near the concession stand where I was hiding from the overwhelming emotion of it all. "Joe," she called out, weaving through the crowd in her cap and gown, and when she reached me, she threw her arms around me in a hug that lasted just a heartbeat longer than a friendly embrace. "I can't believe it's over," she said, and there was something in her voice, a wistfulness, maybe, or a reluctance to let go that made me wonder if she was feeling the same mixture of excitement and loss that was churning in my chest. "I know," I said, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and trying to memorize the feeling of her arms around me. "It feels like the end of everything. Or the beginning," she said, pulling back to look at me with those forest pool eyes. "We're going to do great things, Joe Morrison. Just know it." We exchanged addresses and made promises to write letters, to stay in touch, to visit each other at our respective colleges, and she was heading to the State University in August. while I'd be attending a smaller school about 3 hours away. "Promise me you'll keep writing," she said, squeezing my hands. "The world needs more people who can find beauty in ordinary moments. Promise me you'll change the world," I replied. And she laughed and promised that she'd certainly try. And then we hugged goodbye one more time, and she disappeared into the crowd of celebrating families. And I went home to my empty bedroom where that letter still sat in my desk drawer. 4 pages of 17-year-old honesty that would never see the light of day. That summer was the longest of my young life. I worked at Morrison's hardware store, my uncle's business, stocking shelves and helping customers and trying not to think about Sarah every waking moment. But she was everywhere. Anyway. In the books I read during my lunch breaks, in the songs on the radio, in the very air of our small town that suddenly felt too small to contain all the feelings I was carrying around. I wrote her one letter that July, a cheerful, newsy update about my goal and my excitement about starting college. I told her about the regulars at the hardware store, about the funny things customers said, about the new books I was reading. It was friendly and warm and completely devoid of any romantic undertones. The kind of letter you'd write to a beloved cousin or a family friend. And she wrote back 2 weeks later with an equally cheerful letter about her internship at the County Herald, our local newspaper. She told me about the articles she was writing, about the experienced journalists who were mentoring her, about how excited she was to start college in the fall. Her letter was kind and enthusiastic and made me feel like we were maintaining our friendship beautifully. And then, somehow, our correspondence just stopped by. I'm not sure who was supposed to write the next letter, but maybe I was waiting for her to write. Maybe she was waiting for me. Maybe we were both so focused on preparing for college, on saying goodbye to our hometown lives, that we simply forgot to nurture the connection we'd started. By the time September rolled around and we were both off to our respective colleges, the moment for continuing our correspondence had somehow passed. We were busy with orientation and new classes and roommates and all the overwhelming experiences of starting adult life. I thought about writing to her countless times during my freshman year. I'd sit at my desk in my dorm room, staring at a blank piece of paper, trying to find the right words to restart our conversation. But too much time had passed, and I'd convinced myself that reaching out would seem strange, presumptuous, needy. So I didn't write. And apparently, neither did she. College was good to me. I found my voice as a writer, discovered my passion for teaching, and met lifelong friends who shared my love of literature and learning. I also met Patricia, a beautiful and brilliant psychology major who became my girlfriend, then my fiancée, then my wife of 38 wonderful years. Patricia and I built a good life together. I became an English teacher, just as I dreamed, spending 35 years helping teenagers discover the power of words and stories. Patricia became a school counselor, dedicating her career to helping kids navigate the complicated emotions of adolescence. We raised 3 children who grew into remarkable adults, bought a house with a white picket fence and a garden, and created the kind of marriage that our friends held up as an example of what love could look like when it was nurtured and protected. But I never forgot about Sarah. Not in a way that interfered with my marriage or made me less present for my family, but in the way you never forget your first glimpse of magic. Your first understanding that the world was bigger and more beautiful than you'd previously imagined. And she became a character in the story I told myself about my youth, a symbol of possibilities unexplored and chances not taken. And over the years, I'd occasionally wonder what had become of her. I'd imagine her traveling the world as a correspondent, writing stories that mattered, making the kind of difference she'd always dreamed of making. Well, no, sometimes in idle moments, I'd wonder if she remembered our library conversations, if she ever thought about that spring when we'd briefly orbited each other's lives. And always, that letter remained in my desk drawer, moving with me from my childhood bedroom to my college dorm, to my first apartment, to the house Patricia and I bought when we got married. 4 pages of 17-year-old honesty that had yellowed with age, but never lost their power to make me wonder about the road not taken. Fast forward to the spring of 2018. I was 60 years old, recently retired from teaching, And facing one of those transitions that forces you to reckon with the accumulation of a lifetime, my mother, then 84 and still sharp as a tack, had finally decided that maintaining the family home was becoming too much for her, and she was moving to a beautiful senior living community across town. And it fell to me to help her sort through 60 years of family memories. The house where I'd grown up had become a museum of our family's history. Every closet contained treasures and artifacts. Every drawer held forgotten photographs and letters and report cards from my childhood. It was overwhelming and beautiful and heartbreaking all at once. I was working in my old bedroom, now serving as my mother's sewing room, when I opened the bottom drawer of the desk where I'd done my homework all those years ago. Beneath a pile of old tax returns and recipe cards, my fingers found something that made my heart stop. An envelope, addressed to Sarah Mitchell in my 17-year-old handwriting. Holding that letter in my hands after 43 years was like being struck by lightning made out of memory. Every emotion from that spring night in 1975 came flooding back. The hope, the fear, the desperate longing to connect with someone who had touched my young heart so profoundly. I sat down in my mother's sewing chair and stared at that envelope for a long time, feeling the weight of all the years between that hopeful boy and the man I'd become. And suddenly, I was hit with a question that seemed to echo through every chamber of my heart. What had become of Sarah Mitchell? Thanks to the miracle of modern technology, finding Sarah turned out to be easier than I'd expected. A simple Facebook search revealed that Sarah Mitchell had become Sarah Mitchell Crawford, and her profile picture showed a woman who was recognizably the girl I'd known, transformed by the natural grace that comes with a life well lived. Her silver hair was pulled back in a style that echoed the way she'd worn it in high school, and her eyes, those deep forest pool eyes, still held the intelligence and warmth that had captivated me all those years ago. She was clearly older, as we all were, but she wore her years like a comfortable sweater, with confidence and dignity. And I spent an hour scrolling through her public posts and photos, piecing together the story of her life. How she had, indeed, become the foreign correspondent she dreamed of being. Her Facebook page was filled with photos from around the world. Sarah standing in front of the Berlin Wall before it fell, Sarah interviewing earthquake survivors in Haiti, Sarah receiving awards for her international reporting, and she'd married a fellow journalist named David Crawford, and their wedding photo from 1982 showed a radiant Sarah in a simple white dress, surrounded by friends and family. They'd had 2 children, a daughter who'd become a doctor and a son who'd followed in his parents' footsteps as a writer. It was clear that Sarah had built exactly the life she'd described to me in that library conversation 43 years earlier. She'd achieved her dreams, traveled the world, told stories that mattered, made a difference in ways both large and small, and she looked happy, really, genuinely happy, in a way that made me both proud of her and wistful for the road not taken. After staring at her profile for what felt like hours, I did something that surprised even me. I sent her a friend request, along with a message that took me 30 minutes to compose. Hi, Sarah. I'm not sure if you'll remember me, but I'm Joe Morrison from Lincoln High School. Class of 1970, I was going through some old things today and found myself thinking about our conversations in the library that spring. And I wondered what had become of you. I can see from your profile that you achieved all the dreams you told me about back then. You became that foreign correspondent, traveled the world, told stories that mattered. I'm so proud of what you've accomplished. I became a teacher, as I'd hoped, and spent 35 years helping teenagers discover their own voices through writing. I married a wonderful woman named Patricia, and we raised 3 children who've become remarkable adults. I'd love to catch up. If you're interested, it would be wonderful to hear about your adventures and learn more about the amazing life you've built. Best regards, Joe Morrison. They hit send before I could lose my nerve, then spent the rest of the evening wondering if I'd made a mistake. What if she didn't remember me? What if she thought it was strange that someone she'd barely known in high school was reaching out after 4 decades? What if the conversations that had meant so much to me had been nothing more than friendly politeness to her? But she responded within hours. And her message transported me right back to that golden library table in 1975. Joe Morrison, of course I remember you. How could I forget those wonderful conversations we had in the library? You were the boy who wrote about his grandfather's workshop in a way that made me cry, who talked about teaching with such passion that it made me believe you'd change the world one student at a time. I can't believe you found me on Facebook. It's so wonderful to hear from you. Yes, I did become a correspondent, and it was everything I dreamed it would be, challenging and heartbreaking and beautiful all at once. I was lucky enough to cover some of the most important stories of our time, and I never stopped being grateful for the opportunities I had. I'm so happy to hear you became a teacher. I always knew you'd be wonderful at it, and there was something about the way you talked about literature, about the power of words to capture human experience, that made me think you'd be able to pass that passion on to others. And I'd love to catch up on. And are you planning to come to our 40th reunion next month? I'm flying in from Seattle. That's where David and I retired. It would be so wonderful to see you and hear more about your life. With warm regards, Sarah, our 40th reunion. I'd received the invitation weeks earlier and had been debating whether to attend. High school reunions had always seemed like exercises in comparing lives. Opportunities for people to either brag about their successes or feel inadequate about their choices. But the chance to see Sarah again, to continue the conversation we'd started 43 years earlier, was too compelling to resist. And I wrote back immediately and told her I'd be there. The reunion was held at the Riverside Country Club, a venue that would have impressed our 17-year-old selves, but felt quaint and slightly dated to our 60-year-old eyes. The ballroom was decorated with blue and gold streamers, our school colors, and a slideshow projected photos from our yearbook onto a screen while music from the 1970s played in the background. I arrived early, nervous in a way I hadn't been since I was 17 years old and thinking about giving Sarah Mitchell a letter that would change everything. I'd spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing what to wear, settling on a navy blazer and khakis that I hoped struck the right balance between effort and casualness. When the ballroom was filling up with people I recognized but barely remembered, faces that had aged in ways both surprising and predictable. Former football stars had developed bellies and receding hairlines, while some of the quiet kids from our class had blossomed into confident, successful adults. Everyone wore name tags with their senior pictures on them, tiny time capsules that made the contrast with our current selves both amusing and sobering. And then I found her. Sarah was standing near the check-in table, talking to our old English teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, who was now in her 80s but had made the effort to attend. Sarah wore a simple black dress that was elegant without being flashy, and her silver hair that was styled in a way that somehow made her look both distinguished and youthful. When she saw me approaching, her face lit up with a smile that erased 43 years in an instant. Joe Morrison, and she said, and my name sounded exactly the way it had that afternoon in the library, like it meant something more than just a way to get my attention. It'd be hugged up calm, the kind of hug that old friends give each other, warm and comfortable and tinged with the joy of rediscovery. And she smelled different than she had in high school. Of course, sophisticated perfume instead of teenage shampoo, but something essentially Sarah remained unchanged. You look wonderful, when she said, stepping back to really look at me. Teaching agreed with you. You look exactly like I imagined you would, I replied. Like someone who's lived an extraordinary life. We spent the first hour of the reunion catching up in the way that people do at these events, sharing the highlights of our adult lives, talking about our children and careers, marveling at how quickly the years had passed. She told me about covering the fall of the Berlin Wall, about interviewing refugees and world leaders and Nobel Prize winners. I told her about my favorite students, about the young writers I'd mentored, about the satisfaction of watching teenagers discover their own voices. It was pleasant and warm and exactly what I'd expected. But it wasn't until we found ourselves sitting at a quiet table in the corner of the ballroom, away from the crowd and the music, that our conversation began to take on the depth and intimacy that had characterized our teenage talks. "Joe," she said, leaning forward in a way that reminded me of our library conversations. "I have to tell you something. Those talks we had in high school, they meant more to me than you probably realize." My heart began to beat faster. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I'd been watching you for months before I finally worked up the courage to approach you in the library that day," she said, and her cheeks flushed slightly, as if she were 17 again. "I used to read your essays when Mrs. Rodriguez handed them back, and I was always amazed by your ability to find meaning in ordinary moments. You had this way of writing about small things that made them feel universal." I stared at her, feeling like the world had tilted slightly off its axis. "You were watching me?" She laughed, the same musical laugh I remembered. "I know how that sounds, but yes, I'd memorized your schedule by February of our senior year. I knew you always studied in the library on Thursday afternoons, that you preferred the table in the back corner, that you got this particular expression on your face when you were wrestling with a difficult concept. Sarah," I said, and my voice came out slightly strangled, "I have to tell you something." And then, before I could lose my nerve, before I could talk myself out of it the way I had 43 years earlier, I pulled out that letter, the one I'd written in 1975 and never sent, that had been living in various desk drawers for nearly half a century. "I wrote this for you," I said, so my hands shaking slightly as I placed the yellowed envelope on the table between us. "The day after we talked in the library. I was going to give it to you, but I was too scared of what might happen if I did." Sarah looked at the envelope with my teenage handwriting, her eyes widening with surprise and something that might have been recognition. "I don't expect anything from this," I continued quickly. "I'm not trying to rewrite history or create problems in either of our lives. But I realize that carrying this secret for 43 years has taught me something important about courage. And I thought maybe you deserve to know what I was too afraid to tell you back then." Miss Sarah picked up the letter with gentle hands, studying the envelope as if it were a museum artifact. The noise of the reunion faded into the background as she carefully opened it and began to read the words I had written as a 17-year-old boy. I watched her face as she read, seeing her expression shift through surprise, tenderness, and something that looked like grief. When she reached the part where I'd written about falling in love with her, her eyes filled with tears. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and looked at me with an expression that held 43 years of understanding. "Joe," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something too." What she told me next shattered everything I thought I knew about that spring of 1970. "I was completely infatuated with you," she said, and the words seemed to hang in the air between us like promises long delayed. "I've been watching you since sophomore year, wondering what you were always thinking about so deeply during English class. When Mrs. Rodriguez would hand back our essays, I'd try to read yours over your shoulder because I thought you had the most beautiful way of expressing yourself." Yaman, wiping her eyes with a napkin. "That afternoon in the library wasn't an accident. Joe, I'd been working up the courage to talk to you for weeks. When I saw you sitting there, wrestling with your history paper, I decided it was finally time to take a chance to all. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone in the ballroom could hear it. I went home that night and wrote in my diary that I thought I was falling in love with you," she continued, her voice thick with emotion. "I kept hoping you'd ask me to prom, or that you'd sit with me at lunch, or that you'd give me some sign that you felt something too. When graduation came and went without anything happening, I convinced myself that I'd imagined the connection between us. We sat in stunned silence for a moment, both of us processing this revelation. The reunion continued around us, classmates laughing and dancing and reliving their glory days, but we might as well have been alone in the universe. "You know what the heartbreaking thing is?" Sarah said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "If you had given me that letter, I would have written you back immediately. I would have told you that I felt exactly the same way, that I'd been hoping you'd find the courage to say something first. But what would have happened then? I asked. Would we have dated that summer? Tried to maintain a long-distance relationship through college? Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering. I don't know, she said finally. Maybe we would have written letters all through college, visited each other, tried to build something lasting. Maybe we would have gotten married and built a life together, as she squeezed my hand gently. Or maybe we would have dated for a few months and realized we were better as friends. Maybe the distance would have been too difficult, and we would have drifted apart anyway. Maybe trying to turn our connection into something more would have destroyed the magic of what we had. Do you regret it? I asked. Do you wish things had happened differently? No, she said, and her answer was immediate and firm. I don't regret the life I built, and I don't think you should regret yours either. Had an incredible marriage with David, raised 2 amazing children, had a career that fulfilled me in ways I'd never imagined possible. You found love with Patricia, became the teacher you dreamed of being, raised a family you're proud of. She smiled through her tears. But I do regret that we were both too scared to take the risk of being vulnerable with each other. I regret that we let fear make our decisions for us instead of choosing courage. That conversation with Sarah lasted until the reunion wound down and we were among the last people in the ballroom. And we talked about our marriages, our children, the paths our lives had taken. We shared stories about our greatest joys and deepest sorrows, about the moments that had shaped us into the people we'd become. But mostly, we talked about courage, about the choices we make when we're young and scared, about the way fear can masquerade as wisdom, about the difference between protecting ourselves and limiting ourselves. You know what I've learned in 60 years of life? Sarah said as we finally prepared to leave. The things we don't do, the chances we don't take, the words we don't say, those are the things that haunt us. Not the mistakes we make when we're being brave, but the opportunities we miss when we're being careful. As we walked out of the country club into the warm night air, she turned to me with a smile that was both sad and grateful. Thank you for finally giving me that letter, Joe. Thank you for being brave enough to share it. Even 43 years late, thank you for reading it, I replied. Thank you for telling me the truth about how you felt. It changes everything, knowing that. Does it, though, she asked. Does it change the fact that we both found love and built meaningful lives? Does it change the fact that we're both here now, grateful for the journey that brought us to this moment? She was right, of course. Knowing that Sarah had felt the same way I did didn't change the past or make me wish I'd lived a different life, but it did change my understanding of courage, of risk, of the price we pay when we let fear make our decisions for us. We hugged goodbye in the parking lot, 2 60-year-old friends who had finally shared a truth that needed sharing. We promised to stay in touch this time, to not let another 43 years pass without connection. But the real gift of that evening wasn't the closure it provided about the past. It was the lesson it taught me about the future. My friends, that reunion was 3 years ago now, and it fundamentally changed how I approach every day of my life. You see, what I learned from Sarah, from that 43-year-old letter, from the recognition of how fear had shaped so many of my choices, was this: courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is feeling that fear, acknowledging it, respecting it, and then choosing to act anyway. When I was 17 and I thought courage meant being completely confident, having no doubt about the outcome, I thought brave people never felt scared, never worried about rejection or failure or embarrassment. So when I felt those things, when I felt terrified of Sarah's potential response to my letter, I concluded that I wasn't brave enough to give it to her. Now I understand that courage isn't about being fearless, it's about being afraid and doing it anyway. And it's about recognizing that the regret of not trying is almost always worse than the temporary pain of being rejected. And think about your own life for a moment. How many letters have you written but never sent? How many conversations have you avoided because you were afraid of what the other person might say? How many chances for connection, for growth, fortune have you let slip by because the risk felt too great? I'm not just talking about romantic love, though that's certainly part of it. And I'm talking about all the ways we allow fear to keep us small, to keep us from reaching out to old friends, from trying new experiences, from sharing our true feelings with the people who matter to us. Maybe it's the phone call you have been meaning to make to someone you've lost touch with. Maybe it's the creative project you've been putting off because you're afraid it won't be good enough. And maybe that's the conversation you need to have with a family member about something that's been bothering you for years. Maybe it's as simple as the compliment you want to give a stranger, the volunteer opportunity you have been considering, or the class you've been thinking about taking but worry you're too old for. At our age, my friends, we have something that our younger selves didn't have, the wisdom that comes from experience. We've survived enough disappointments to know we can handle whatever comes of our sin. We've lived through enough changes to know that most things work out, one way or another. We have the perspective now to understand what really matters and what doesn't. We also have something else our younger selves lacked, the knowledge that time is not unlimited. We don't have the luxury of thinking we'll get around to being brave someday. Someday is now. The letters we need to send, the calls we need to make, the conversations we need to have, they can't wait indefinitely. And to that reunion with Sarah, I've become something of a student of courage. I've started paying attention to the moments when fear tries to make decisions for Shaw over me, when the voice of caution drowns out the whisper of possibility. And I've started sending letters, not literal letters on them necessarily, though I've written a few of those too, but all the metaphorical letters that represent connection, vulnerability, the willingness to reach out despite uncertainty. I called my college roommate, whom I hadn't spoken to in 15 years, just to tell him how much his friendship had meant to me during those formative years. And it turned out he'd been thinking about me too, wondering how my life had turned out. We've been having monthly phone calls ever since. I wrote a letter to my high school baseball coach, who's now in his 80s, to thank him for the lessons in perseverance and teamwork that served me well long after I stopped playing sports. He wrote back with tears in his eyes. And he said, because in 40 years of coaching, very few former players had ever told him what his guidance had meant to them. And I started volunteering at the local literacy center, finally acting on something I'd been thinking about for years. And I was afraid I'd be too old, too out of touch with modern teaching methods. But it turns out that older volunteers are treasured for their patience and life experience. And I've had difficult conversations with family members about things that needed to be said. I've reached out to former students who made an impact on my life. So I've taken classes, joined more in clubs, said yes to invitations that my cautious side wanted to decline. Not every one of these letters has led to the outcome I hoped for. Some conversations were awkward. Some connections didn't flourish the way I expected. Experiences were less fulfilling than I'd imagined, but none of them led to the kind of 43-year regret that comes from never trying at all. So here's my challenge to you today. My friends, what letters are you carrying around in your metaphorical desk drawer? What connections are you afraid to make? What conversations are you avoiding? What experiences are you postponing because the risk feels too great? This week, not someday, not when you feel more confident, not when the timing is perfect, but this week, I want you to send one of those letters. Start small if you need to. Send a text to an old friend you've been thinking about. Write a note to someone who made a difference in your life. Call a relative you haven't spoken to in too long. Sign up for that class. Volunteer for that organization. Apply for that opportunity. The point isn't to guarantee a particular outcome. The point is to practice courage, to strengthen that muscle that allows us to act despite our fears. Every time you choose vulnerability over safety, connection over isolation, you make it a little easier to be brave the next time. Remember, courage is contagious. And when you model the willingness to take emotional risks, to reach out despite uncertainty, to speak truth even when your voice shakes, you give other people permission to be brave too. You become part of the solution to the epidemic of loneliness and disconnection that affects so many people, especially those of us who sometimes feel like our best opportunities for connection are behind us. And they're not behind us. My friends, they're all around us, waiting for someone brave enough to notice them and act. Guarcia and I still exchange emails several times a year. We share articles we think the other would enjoy, update each other on our children and grandchildren, remember our spouses who are no longer with us. David passed away 2 years ago, and Patricia has been gone for 5 years now. In our grief, we've found comfort in friendship, in the shared understanding that comes from having lived full lives. But our correspondence isn't about romance or regret, and it's about the gift of connection, the joy of being truly known by another person, the comfort of having someone in the world who remembers who you were when you were young and believes in who you're still becoming. That letter I wrote at 17 was never really about trying to change the past. It was about honoring the truth of my feelings, about refusing to let fear have the final word in my story. Garroting it with Sarah taught us both something important, that courage isn't about being sure of the outcome. It's about being willing to honor what's real and true in our hearts, regardless of how others might respond. The letters you're afraid to send, literal or metaphorical, they're not really about guaranteeing particular outcomes either. They're about living authentically, about refusing to let fear make your decisions for you, about choosing love over safety whenever possible. Because at the end of the day, my friends, doing the letters we don't send are the ones we regret most, and the chances we don't take are the ones that haunt us. The love we don't express is the love that dies with us. But the courage we show, the connections we make, the truth we speak, that's the legacy we leave for. That's how we make our remaining years count for something beautiful and meaningful and brave. That original letter, the one I wrote to Sarah in 1970, sits in a frame on my desk now. Not as a monument to regret, but as a reminder of the power of honest feeling, even when that honesty comes 43 years late. Next to it is a photo from our class reunion, Sarah and me, both silver-haired and lined with years, smiling at the camera with the kind of joy that comes from finally telling the truth. So we look like what we are. Old friends who are grateful for the journey that brought them to that moment of connection. And next to that is a new notebook, filled with the beginnings of letters I'm working up the courage to send, because I've learned that courage isn't something you achieve once and then possess forever, and it's something you practice day by day, a choice by choice, and letter by letter. Your letters are waiting, my friends. The people who need to hear from you are hoping you'll find the courage to reach out. The experiences that could enrich your life are hoping you'll say yes. The connections that could bring you joy are hoping you'll take the risk. Don't wait 43 years to be brave. Don't let fear make your decisions for you. Don't leave your letters unsent, your truth unspoken, your heart unshared. Choose courage. Choose connection. Choose love over fear, vulnerability over safety, possibility over certainty. Because the world needs your letters. It needs exactly what you have to offer, delivered with exactly the heart you have to give. Thank you for spending this time with me today, for letting me share this story that's been living in my heart for so long. If Sarah's story and mine has reminded you of your own unsent letters, your own moments when courage called and you're still deciding whether to answer, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you think someone else might benefit from this reminder about the importance of choosing courage over comfort, please share this with them. And sometimes we all need permission to be brave. Until next time, keep choosing courage. Keep reaching out. Keep believing that your willingness to be vulnerable makes the world a more connected, more loving place. The letters you're afraid to send might be exactly what someone needs to receive. And I'll see you soon.